Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thanks everybody for coming. I want to first thank our host, the Roman Center for Global Affairs, and as well co-sponsors of this event, the Geography Department, the Sociology and Anthropology Department, and the History Department. This talk is also in conjunction with a seminar that I am co-teaching with Professor Casey McKinney, so I want to thank her and our students in that seminar as well. We're lucky today to be joined by Don Mitchell to discuss these ongoing struggles over public space. Don is Distinguished Professor of Geography at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. He's the author or co-author of 6 books, including They Saved the Crops, Labor, Landscape, and the Struggle Over Industrial Farming in Bracero-era California, and The Right to the City, Social Justice and the Fight for Public Space. Additionally, John has published dozens of academic articles, polemics, and somewhat recently wrote the obituary for his mentor, the late geographer Neil Smith. Don received his PhD from Rutgers in 1992. Broadly speaking, his work is invested in the historical study of the production of landscapes, especially as it relates to workers and working classes, the creation and disappearance of public space, and spatial politics as a form of social control. And much of this work is in some way in dialogue with Marxism, a major influence. Don also founded the People's Geography Project as a way to do public geography, an initiative that enjoyed global popularity as it was interpreted in different ways throughout the world. In 1998, Don became a MacArthur Fellow, and 10 years later, a Guggenheim Fellow. Somewhere in that time, he published a little article called Confessions of a Desk-Bound Radical in Antipode, a spirited explanation as to why he is not an activist. This was interesting to me, because one of my first memories of Don is just how unbound to his desk he actually was. I was walking across the quad at Syracuse University, where I was a student, frisbees flying everywhere, that kind of thing in the fall, heading for his office hours, when suddenly he appeared there. "Where are you going?" he said. "To your office hours," I replied, which were supposed to be happening at that very moment. "Well, come on," he said, "let's go down here instead." We ended up at the picket line and striking workers at the university, as Don was one of many faculty members who at that time led solidarity actions with different service workers. So, desk-bound or not today, in many ways, given these even considerable professional accomplishments, I always remember Don's work, or I think of Don's work as really the ability to bridge the sort of theoretical insights of academia and politics in a way that is both sensible and radical. And I think for that, we owe him a round of applause. So please join me in welcoming Don.
Thank you very much, Jamie. It's really a delight to be here at Middlebury. But before I get going, I should point out that I think Jamie remembered the story a little bit wrong. The way I remember it is he showed up in my office and said, "What the hell are you doing in here? There's a picket line we need to be on." But in any event, both of us spent as much time as we could in that. This is I think my first year at Syracuse, maybe my second, in trying to figure out ways to support the service workers who were on strike at the time. It's a very, very interesting strike, in fact, and in many ways forged a lot of the ways I think about our life in academia, which I'm not going to talk much about today, but afterwards, if folks want to talk about that, I'm happy to. What I'm going to talk about today is this question of public space and why it matters and the ways in which it might matter. And I'm going to do it really in 3 parts. The first part is the usual academic stuff of talking about where ideas come from and why they matter and that kind of stuff. For those of you who don't care that much about that, there'll be a lot of pictures. The second part tells 3 stories from Oakland and Berkeley, California. Relatively recent stories. One of them over People's Park itself, but a couple of others. One about Occupy Oakland, the other one about a sit-lie law, an anti-homeless law in Berkeley that was voted on in 2012. And then the last part, I'm going to get all theoretical. And so those of you who aren't into that, there'll still be pictures. So you should be all right. So I want to talk about this question of the end of public space and where it comes from. That's how I'm going to begin. So public space is itself a struggle. 25 years ago, the intensity of these struggles was only beginning to be recognized in the urban literature. Urban public space was largely understood before then as a design issue, or perhaps one of policing. Two books that were published at the outset of the 1990s catalyzed a new and sharply critical, and in fact an eventually quite wide-ranging set of research on the role of public space in the making of more or less just cities. The first book was Mike Davis's City of Quartz, published in 1999, and the second was Michael Sorkin's edited Variations on a Theme Park, The End of Public Space and the New American City. In powerful prose and with striking images, Mike Davis examined how control over space was being affected and to what ends in Los Angeles. Transformations in public space were at the heart of Davis's analysis. Private encroachments by capital, homeowners, business associations, and so forth into the public realm were remaking the city as what he called a violent frontier of capital accumulation. This was a complex and very contradictory process. In fact, the homeowners' taxpayer revolt in California was as much an admission of bourgeois and police loss of control over the city as it was anything else. And it was one set in a context of a city whose ethnic profile was rapidly changing. Public space was the space where changes in the city were fought out. And it was, at least in downtown Los Angeles, a space where the forces of a narrowly prescribed order seemed to be winning out. Private policing, bum-proof benches, and other anti-homeless tactics, business improvement districts, hyper-defensive space, all of these seem to indicate the end of the public city, if not the end of publicly accessible space as such. The authors in Variations on a Theme Park, which in fact included Mike Davis, who reprised one of his arguments from City of Quartz, picked up on this theme in various ways, examining the gentrification of the gentrification frontier as a violent frontier, as Neil Smith did, or the mall or Disney World as the new model for downtown, as Margaret Crawford and Sorkin himself did, the rise of the analogous city of sky bridges and tunnels, as Trevor Boddy talked about, and the commodification of space and history attendant upon the creation of festival marketplaces, as Christine Boyer talked about. Most striking in the book, though, is the degree to which public space is not theorized. Rather, an image or a shared understanding of what public space is mostly assumed. The image seems to be one of open or relatively open access, and of light policing. Public space seems primarily to be defined by what it is not, that is, private space. The end of public space in the American city, in this view, is its privatization. So both of these books seem to name and describe something crucial that was happening in the American city at the outset of the 1990s, and thus by extension, other parts of the developed world. Together with David Harvey's seminal arguments about the rise of the entrepreneurial city, and Ed Soja's arguments about the postmodern city that in many ways ran parallel to and provided a little bit of inspiration for Mike Davis's arguments, these books helped set off a period of intense re-theorizing of the city, of which the theorization and critical historical analysis of public space was a central part. The degree of intensity of research after 1990s can be measured in the exponential growth of published work on public space. There was only a smattering of studies on public space in the geographical literature. I'm just going to confine myself to what geographers wrote for a moment. A smattering in the geographical literature before the 1990s. In the 1970s, there were sometimes as many as 4 articles, chapters, or books on public space a year that were printed in the Anglophonic geographical press, many of them exploring public space in relationship to phenomenology, but some analyzing public space in relation to Oscar Newman's notion of defensible space. But these tailed off, and from 1980 until 1988, there were never more than 2 pieces written on public space And in 2 of those years, none at all were written. But then the drumbeat quickened. There were 6 in 1988, 9 in 1989 and 1990, and 16 in 1992. In 1991, there were 6. And then it quickened again. There were 23 in 1993, 29 in 1996, and 40 in 1998. Public space was hot as an issue, and it remained hot. Searching the Scopus database and using a really quite restrictive definition, I identified 20 Anglophonic articles published in geography journals or by geographers for 2000, 26 for 2004, 45 for 2008, and 49 for 2012. I think there are many reasons for the sustained and, in fact, growing interest in public space. The agenda that Davis, Sorkin, and others set, which reflected the rather stark and observable transformations of the city that marked the end of Keynesianism, was and remains an important one. In what ways, they were asking, was the city being remade to reflect particular class interests? And what did that mean for living in and the use of the city by everyone else? What did it mean economically, socially, and politically? Who benefited from the seeming end of public space, a space representative of and conducive to a particular public that had been created in the Keynesian or social democratic era in Western and especially American cities, as the city was reclaimed through redevelopment, gentrification, technical change, transformations in policing and law, and the reassertion of the primacy of private property. A concomitant question of just who constituted the public also seemed to be taking on added relevance as a new neoliberal order was being built in cities. On the ground, a resurgence of urban unrest, exemplified in the Los Angeles uprisings of 1992, as well as any number of smaller skirmishes, the poles of which are perhaps best represented by, on the one hand, the Tompkins Square riot of 1988, or the People's Park riot of 1991, and on the other hand, by the sort of race conflict depicted in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing of 1989. All of these made it clear that public space had to be understood as both a space of conflict and a space essential to the creation and resolution of conflict. Similarly, by the time that Mike Davis was writing, the crisis of homelessness, which many interpreted to be a crisis of public space, was into its 2nd decade. We're now into the 4th decade of the crisis of homelessness. It's hard to imagine a crisis that lasts for 4 decades, right? But we still talk about homelessness as if it's a crisis rather than a normal part of our capitalist society. Wilson and Kelling's original broken windows thesis for policing was promulgated in large part as a defense against homeless people's use and occupation of public space, which Wilson and Kelling saw as necessarily detrimental to order in the city. Homeless people, they argued, either directly ruined or led to the ruin of public space, an argument echoed by any number of pundits and in any number of policy documents. A quite loud chorus developed in support of new quality of life laws to govern homeless people's use of public space, and perhaps to remove them from public space altogether. Yet homeless populations continued to expand and to seek refuge in parks, on sidewalks, in riverbank encampments, or elsewhere, either because no other shelter was available, or because it was unsafe, or because it was closed during daytime hours. Homeless people forced the question of public space. What it was for, who belonged in it, and who didn't. How it related to the shifting dynamics of property in the city, and so forth. As Jeremy Waldron, a law scholar and philosopher, famously argued as early as 1991, homeless people could only be, that is, they could only live and live as humans to the degree that they had access to public space. If you close public space, you close the ability of homeless people simply to be. And not only homeless people required public space in that sense, so too did political people. And their public space, the space for organizing and protesting, also seemed to be shrinking, if not disappearing altogether in the 1980s and into the 1990s. Already in 1984, the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco, and probably much earlier, the regulation of protest in public space became a question of renewed urgency, both politically and academically, as urban authorities restricted protest to specially designated and well out of the way protest zones, denying activists the right to confront convention delegates head on. This move was of a piece with larger trends in policing. Scholars of protests across a whole range of disciplines had noted a shift in protest policing tactics after the 1960s, from what in the 1960s was understood to be an escalation of force strategy to what later became a negotiated management strategy. Instead of beating protesters up or otherwise basing policing on force, police, aided by transformations in law governing the right to assembly and speech, engaged in a dual strategy. First, the zoning of space for peaceful protest, outside of which protesting of all sorts would be banned. And second, negotiation with protest organizers over the form of protest, including how arrests were going to be handled. Both strategies evidently reworked the relationship between public space and politics, emphasizing public space as a space of control, of limits, and again, of order. Such a transformation called into question the nature of public space and the construction of publicity, that is, publicness, the being in public of people, and the possibilities for or against the formation of a political public sphere, as well as for or against political action. The possibilities seemed, for many in protest movements anyway, now to be highly constrained. Order seemed, in this realm as in the realm of homelessness, to be the order of the day. Many people in cities welcomed the new order of order, especially as crime and the fear of crime increased during the 1980s, and as gentrification, as a specific form of capital circulation in the built environment, reopened inner cities for bourgeois settlement. Orderly public spaces were understood to be both a necessity of urban development and transformation and an outcome of it. Public space had to be made safe for capital and for new urbanites. Festival marketplaces and other forms of private public space, such as New York's privately owned public spaces, the bonus plazas that developers created in order to build higher or to build denser, also known as POPs, dating from the 1960s but gaining popularity in the 2 decades that followed. These were embraced by suburbanites, tourists, and new urbanists alike. They provided a new kind of public space, one in which fear of violence or the other was held largely at bay by private police forces and by the different ways private property owners, as compared to city governments, could control public access. New opportunities for urban sociability were thus opened up as old ones were closed down. Privately owned space became the place for urban encounters and urban sociability. If these forms of sociability were largely mediated through commodity production and consumption, then so much the better. Controlled private public spaces such as malls, festival marketplaces, and POPs were meant to be part of the new economic base of the city as manufacturing fled for the ex-urban fringe or for overseas. Yet by the 1980s, cities were realizing they could not rely solely on the production of privately owned public space for their urban and economic well-being. New modes of control needed to be invented for those other public spaces, streets and sidewalks, for example, or parks, that the contemporary city inherited from previous eras, and which were therefore structured and controlled according to different social sensibilities and seemed wise in the current moment. Even as the fiscal crisis of the state at all scales reduced government's capacities to order and regulate, much less maintain, public space. Conservancies and trusts, funded by wealthy benefactors but chartered for the public good, as well as business improvement districts funded by special private taxes, arose to fill the void. The construction, maintenance, and especially the governance of public space was significantly privatized. Coming from a different direction, though certainly interwoven with the trends that I've just been talking about, the increased presence of women, gays, and minorities in public space as workers in remade labor markets, as claimants to public rights, as political actors, and especially as women, gays, and minorities, raised in new ways the question of who public space is for and what violence in public space is meant to contain. Women's, gays, and minorities' insistence on being present and visible in public space forced dominant society to confront its ongoing exclusions. Gay pride parades and Take Back the Night events, to take just two prominent examples dating from the 1970s, threw into question the dominant coding of public space as heteronormative and or masculinist. And the significant victories of the civil rights movement, which dismantled many de jure exclusions to space, both public and private, for African Americans and other racialized people, forced dominant society to confront ongoing de facto exclusions. To put all this another way, at the beginning of the 1990s, public space simultaneously seemed to be being closed down, that is, brought to an end, through the pressurizing forces of order, quality of life, and protest policing and privatization in its many guises, and at the same time opened up anew through the concerted struggles of new social movements and the invention of new modes of urban sociability. If the end of public space seemed nigh, and that's in the titles of those books I started with, new ends for public space were nonetheless being invented. Though not always interpreted in this way, Davis's and Sorkin's work made it clear that public space still was a struggle, and a struggle worth engaging in. The tidal wave of work on public space that has since washed over geography and urban studies more broadly is mere confirmation of this fact. In 1995, so almost 20 years ago, I sought to critically engage the end of public space arguments and to show why they mattered for understanding struggles for the democratic city. Analyzing the 1991 riot sparked by University of California plans to redevelop People's Park in Berkeley, I sought to show how what might be called actually existing public space was produced through struggle around two contrasting ideals of public space. Public space as a space of politics and democratic struggle, and public space as a space of retreat and urban leisure. Such ideals mapped onto questions of whether public space was a commons constructed through practice, which was both customary and contentious, or a gift of the state or of developers, as well as whether public space was the space for living, for forms of life, or a space only to visit, a space in which we are always only ever guests. I sought to examine the often contradictory roles public space plays in urban politics and economics, the functions it serves for the housed and unhoused, and the degree it aids or does not aid in the formation of publics and counterpublics. I understood these to be questions of law as well as practice, rights as well as custom, policing as well as protest. Thus, they were questions of the relationship between public and private, the domestic and the civic, and the structures of inclusion and exclusion. They were questions of who owns public space as well as who controls it. They were questions of the ends of public space as well as the means. And I was actually quite explicit in the conclusions that I reached. Arguments in behalf of the thesis of the end of public space, I wrote back then, suggested an orderly, controlled vision of public space as squeezing out other ways of imagining public spaces. Should quote my own word properly. The recent history of People's Park suggests that these arguments are, if profoundly important, too simple. Oppositional movements continually strive to assure the currency of more expansive visions of public space. Still, to the degree that the Disneyfication of public space advances and political movements are shut out of public space, oppositional movements lose the space where they may be represented or may represent themselves as legitimate parts of the public. As the words and actions of the protagonists in Berkeley back in 1991 suggest, the stakes are high and the struggles over them might very well be bloody. But that is at once the promise and the danger of public space. Yet much, and perhaps over time, most of the public space research that is made up of the tidal wave that I described earlier has been in opposition, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly, to narratives about the end of public space, often hollowing those narratives out by assuming that the end of public space is taken by writers and researchers like Davis, Sorkin, or myself as a given, a fact, a full description of the historical geographical moment, rather than as a dialectical proposition meant to be examined materially, as in the conclusion I just quoted, or even a hypothesis to be tested. And I think there's a cost to this opposition to and dismissal of the end of public space arguments. Important questions like the ones I laid out a moment ago about what public space is have too often been sidelined as scholars have tried to show what public space is not. That it is not a space of simple control, for example, or that it is not a material site, but rather an imminent production that comes into being through momentary practice. Ignoring the ways in which the end of public space is always a tendency, though definitely a contradictory tendency, within capitalist urban economies leads to a too easy set of assumptions about possibilities for cosmopolitan or egalitarian encounters in urban space, rather than an analysis of the constraints that might make such encounters less likely. It often leads to an untenable idealism that assumes the rather full malleability of space, as well as the irrelevance of law or the state or powerful corporations and individuals to shape space and actions in it. It fails to raise the question of how the tendency towards the end of public space within capitalism is contested, as well as the specific and limited ways in which it is forestalled. It risks being unable to understand how the tendency towards the end of public space, in opposition to that tendency, shapes the ends of public space. Historically, in the present, and in the future. The end of public space is, in other words, an ongoing history. So by exploring three recent moments of intense use and struggle over public space in California's East Bay, that is Oakland and Berkeley, I would like in the next few moments to revive the question of the end and the ends of public space and to examine this ongoing, perhaps never-ending history. I want to revive again the question of public space's promise as well as its danger. And I want to show that the issues that sparked the boom in public space research in the first place, both the scholarly and the social issues, have not gone away. So this is the first case, Occupy Oakland. Unlike Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Oakland occupied a public space. Oakland's Frank Agawa Plaza in front of City Hall was designed and built in the 1990s as a public space for political assembly, surrounded by a park to be used by nearby single-room occupancy residents as well as by area office workers. Much of it developed, it seems, with the sort of dictates for good public space design that William H. White long promoted. The park's designers understood Agawa Plaza itself to be, as one of them put it, the front yard of City Hall. As such, it was expected to host a variety of public events. Cultural performances, festivals, campaigns, speeches, important public announcements, ceremonies, and celebrations. This, of course, included expected protests and demonstrations, not just about local issues, but also those affecting the nation as a whole, so crowds at times could be large. The design team sought to accommodate both celebrations and protests in the plaza's design. In particular, they created the plaza as an amphitheater, a forum, with a natural stage, seating spread around, and plenty of room on the lawn for larger gatherings. While speakers with their back to City Hall addressed the crowd directly faced and addressed City Hall. Unlike a number of the other architects and landscape architects represented in the book from which I just quoted Agawa Plaza designer Michael Piatak, a book called Beyond Zuccotti Park. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you don't. Which seeks to understand the role public space played in the Occupy movement. Architects and designers in this book who more than once complained that their design had been hijacked by occupiers, and thus the Occupy movement, no matter how important its causes, used public space illegitimately. Unlike them, Piatak was thrilled by the occupation of Frank-Agawa Plaza. He noted that while other East Bay cities had plazas suitable for protest, none hosted a park-like setting as well. The convenient combination of park and plaza became simultaneously a domestic and civic setting. The soft carpeted park, the people's mattress, became the bedroom, and the paved forum became the formal living room. Moreover, the various small seating areas designed with the needs of SRO residents and office workers in mind provided space for the small group meetings that were such an integral part of the Occupy structure. Piatak saw the park and plaza as a perfect venue for making public both the broad grievances of the global Occupy movement and the more specific grievances of Oakland and the East Bay, such as police brutality and the racism behind it. When they won the competition to build the park and plaza, Piatak and his firm were not known for public space design. Rather, they specialized in designing subsidized housing developments. We could foresee none of these events that marked Occupy Oakland, Piatak says. But by following our instincts as housing designers, we took into consideration the open space needs for everyday activities and for those special events that take place in domestic settings, and made an effort to include communal versions of these things at the doorstep to Oakland City Hall. The result was to create, rather remarkably, a public space that functioned and could be occupied, that is, lived in, as a public space. The Oakland City government's just as remarkably confused response to Occupy Oakland provided quite definitive proof of just how successful this making public through the occupation of space designed to be domestic of public space was. So does the remarkably violent suppression of Occupy Oakland when it finally came. A suppression that in the end seemed to deny the very reason for and design of Frank-Agawa Plaza and its surrounding park. Public space had been put to an end, a political end, by its occupiers. Public space was put to a quite different kind of end, more or less eliminated as a political force by the police. This is how struggles that make and destroy public space unfold. This is how the tendency towards the end of public space plays out. So a second story. In November 2012, that is about a year after Occupy Oakland encampment was destroyed, the residents of Berkeley were asked to consider, and not for the first time, a ballot initiative that would have created a new sit-lie law. Berkeley's Civil Sidewalks Initiative, or Measure S, like so many of its brethren around the country, sought to outlaw sitting or lying on sidewalks in districts zoned commercial between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 p.m., except in cases of medical emergency, or someone sitting in a wheelchair, or on a permanent public bench, or at a bus stop, or at a street event for which a permit had been received, or in an outdoor cafe with seating. Violators were subject to a $75 fine, or the equivalent in community service, for a first offense. Subsequent offenses could be charged as misdemeanors. Before a citation could be issued, police would be required to issue a warning and the offender given a chance to desist. Warnings were to be effective for 30 days. Supporters of the law, which included the mayor and some city council members, various merchant associations, and an organization calling itself Livable Berkeley, argued that such laws had proved effective in more than 60 U.S. cities and that Berkeley was being asked to consider it only now because all previous efforts in what they called a humanitarian city had failed to dissuade the formation of what they called street encampments, nor to disperse those who resist our help. The initiative itself declared in its findings that public spaces in commercial districts have become increasingly inhospitable due to groups of individuals, often with dogs, having created encampments on sidewalk areas on our commercial streets. The encampments obstruct pedestrian access and result in litter, debris, and waste left on our sidewalks. Moreover, city parks are open and available during the day for everyone's use. If passed, the measure would not come into effect until July 2013 to give time for outreach workers who are really, in fact, business improvement district paid ambassadors and not social workers or other professionals. They give them time to educate street populations about the new law before it was enforced. For that reason, advocates argued a primary purpose of Measure S was to help people get social services, as well as to help local merchants grow local jobs and ensure civil and welcoming sidewalks for everyone. Opponents, who included other city council members, some merchants, the American Civil Liberties Union, the University of California, Berkeley student government, and various interest groups, noted that there were 4 homeless people in Berkeley for every shelter bed, and that the shelter shortage was especially acute for homeless youth. The population that seemed most directly targeted by the initiative. They argued that the ambassadors were not trained in mental health or homeless outreach. They noted that a San Francisco City Controller's report had found that that city's law, upon which the Berkeley initiative was in fact based, had failed to improve merchant corridors, serve as a useful tool for the San Francisco Police Department, connect services to those who violate the law, and positively contribute to public safety. They questioned how criminalizing sitting on sidewalks would, as advocates asserted, help people get the critical services they need to transform their lives. Regarding the text of the law, a columnist for the online Berkeley Daily Planet wrote, "Fortunately for me, I'll get an exemption for sitting on the sidewalk under the shade of a nice tree or building. I get to sit in my wheelchair and won't be bothered. I will, however, continue to be inconvenienced by the growing number of cafe and restaurant owners who have annexed the public sidewalks with their sprawling tables and chairs. At least the good folks sitting on the sidewalk will move out of my path of travel when asked. Most times I needn't bother even to ask, but those darn tables and chairs refuse to move even an inch." The proponents of the law outspent opponents by a factor of 10 to 1. Berkeley residents nonetheless rejected the law 52 to 48%. It was the first time since 1994 that voters in any city in the United States rejected a ballot initiative criminalizing homelessness. In fact, the last time was in Berkeley also, in 1994. The head of the Telegraph Business Improvement District warned that this rejection would attract more loiterers to Berkeley sidewalks. The bid and its counterparts in other districts nonetheless conceded defeat on this front and turned their attention to launching a redevelopment program aimed at street redesign that would make Telegraph Avenue and downtown Shattuck Avenue more welcoming to middle and upper income consumers and less welcoming to the destitute. Like the events at Frank-Agawa Park, the fight over Measure S was a fight over the ends of public space. For a minority of voters, at least if the arguments against Measure S are representative of their views, public space needed to be cleared of undesirable people, especially those who resist our help. Cleanliness and order trumped being in space. Public space is public only to the degree that it is made easy to move through and cleared of unsightly encampments. But for a majority of voters in Berkeley, an end of public spaces like sidewalks is to provide, at least one end of public spaces like sidewalks, is to provide a place for homeless and other destitute people to sit, maybe even to hang out. It is a place where all people can be regardless of their means. If the end of public space is a tendency, then sometimes that tendency is thwarted by people acting democratically. So the last story. It's People's Park again, because I've been fascinated by this place since I was like 13 years, actually since I was 8 years old. My dad was a professor at Berkeley, and during the first People's Park riot, he came home from work early. He was an engineer. It's on the other side of campus. But that was when the helicopters sprayed tear gas and missed the protesters and hit the scientists and engineers. Right? So he had to flee. He was home. I came home from school and there was my dad. It was kind of bizarre. So I've known about it ever since then. Fascinated ever since. whole, kind of psychological thing going on here. So, but People's Park again, I'll never get away from it. Another place where homeless and other destitute people hang out in Berkeley is People's Park. It has served this end since it was first created in 1969. Many people in Berkeley, with some degree of justification these days, do not think that People's Park is a safe space. Its status as a refuge for the destitute, which it has always been, is certainly not safe, and it never has been safe. On December 28, 2011, that is not long after the Occupy encampments were cleared out of most US cities, and when students in Berkeley were not in class and many housed people were enjoying the holidays, the University of California sent bulldozers into the park. Unlike other such moves in the past, this one met no resistance. The move was focused on the west end of the park, behind the free stage, an area of community gardens, tall trees, and winding paths, and also apparently of rats, which was the pretext for coming in and clearing it out. Bulldozers and crews ripped up the gardens, which dated from 1979 when activists themselves had ripped up a small asphalt parking lot that the university had built on that site. The bulldozers also knocked down the trees, some of which predated the park itself. And they destroyed a pergola, which had been built out of the net posts of the volleyball courts that UC built in 1991 that sparked those 1991 riots, but which it gave up only a few years later. Describing its actions as routine heavy park maintenance, UC argued that it had to remove the pergola because it was heavily covered in vegetation. A couple of you know what a pergola is. It's a frame for supporting vegetation. Even though it destroyed the community gardens, the university said that the overall look of the park itself will not change. The stage, the benches, community gardens, and other features will remain intact. By intact, UC seemed to mean that the community gardens would be replaced with, as they put it, seedlings for smaller plants that consume little water and are decorative. The tall trees were removed to improve views for students moving into a soon-to-be completed dormitory across the street. Perhaps the most symbolic destruction was of the Council Grove, a circle of trees that served as the site for many People's Park Council meetings in the early 1970s, where questions of user control and design were debated. The current anemic iteration of the Council, the People's Park Community Advisory Board, an organization that the university itself created and is bound by its own agreements to consult with, was not consulted or even informed of the heavy maintenance, learning of it only as park users saw the crew and equipment arrive in the early morning hours, and the university released a simultaneous press statement. The lack of mobilization against this move by the university suggests, however, that, as many argue, and in fact have long argued, after more than 4 decades of struggle and stasis, People's Park is ripe for change. The Telegraph Avenue Business Improvement District certainly thinks it is. In August 2011, so a few months before this, it had sent a letter to the university laying out a set of recommendations for the redevelopment of People's Park, which it hoped would turn it into an asset for the nearby business district rather than continue as they put it, a haven for drug dealing, drug and alcohol abuse, and various antisocial and criminal behaviors that these induce. A function that has persisted, the Business Improvement District asserted, only because of what it called a cadre of activists who zealously protected the park's status quo. As the bulldozers were still at work, the president of the bid indicated this was the beginning of the implementation of its recommendations. In fact, a park activist using various open records requests discovered that UC had spent some $12,000 on this first round of heavy park maintenance and had plans to spend another $200,000 more on 2 more phases of the park. Now, this is at a time when, if the movie At Berkeley is to be believed, the University of California Berkeley campus was down to 1 lawnmower still on the, 1 person mowing lawns still on the payroll at UC. They cut maintenance so much up to 2011. To this point, in fact, to like a couple of weeks ago, the university has refused to make its plans for the park public. Many think that the December 2011 operation was a first highly attenuated effort to begin to act on the recommendations made in 2007 by the San Francisco design consultants MK Think. Working with UC as well as with the Community Advisory Board, MK Think produced a draft plan for park redevelopment, though it seems the plan was never finalized nor acted on before the end of 2011. One reason for inaction was, of course, the economic crisis, and in particular the financial crisis that racked the campus immediately after the draft report was completed, and was continuing even as the bulldozers entered the park, if by then in a rather attenuated form. A starting proposition for MK Think was that in its current state, the delivery in the park of food and social services for at-risk populations is incompatible with the broad objective of making this space enjoyable for community members. The at-risk population was understood by the design firm as having no positive agency of its own, nor were they considered to be community members. Rather, MK Think asserted this population needed to be dealt with through what they called professionally administrated comprehensive care, which would provide self-empowerment skills and medical care. People's Park, the consultants argued, did not have and could not conceivably have the facilities to make such care possible, even though hundreds and sometimes thousands of meals a week are served in the park, largely through mutual aid principles. MK Think argued instead that removing homeless and other indigent people from the park while remembering and memorializing the park's history would help the space form an identity around humanistic values. The problem with People's Park, according to MK Think, was that unlike almost all other parks, it had never benefited from a formal design and planning process. The draft report sought to remedy that shortcoming. To that end, MK Think sought to align design means with what it understood to be the proper ends of public spaces like People's Park. One design suggestion was therefore to rework the southwestern corner of the park, which is right where the university began its maintenance operations in December 2011, to turn that into a hardscaped commons, as they called it, of about 1/10 of an acre. The copy of the draft plan that I got my hands on had been annotated by a People's Park activist. The activist wrote here, "The whole park now is the commons," suggesting a rather different vision of what kind of public space People's Park is and ought to be than that proposed by the design firm. The difference is at its sharpest in MK Think's plans to fill the park with programming. Design features meant to allow for or encourage highly specific activities. Perhaps not dissimilar from Michael Piatog's vision for Frank-Ogawa Plaza, but with little evidence of the latter's joy in a park's expropriation by its users. The end of public space in this view was to provide a space for programming, for special events and recreational activities, for university-sponsored events as well as for theatrical performances, poetry readings, art installations, farmers markets, and outdoor workshops. In MK Think's view, occupation of public space by poor people without homes or places to hang out, which is a traditional function of People's Park, or for the provision of free meals to these very same people, did not constitute appropriate programming. Commonly produced space, a space taken and made commons, with, as with People's Park, use rights and therefore the bases for exclusion reasonably well understood. This was not properly public space, a space enjoyable and welcoming for all community members. So, like I said, I'm going to go all theoretical just for a couple minutes here. So public space is a struggle. And these three stories provide glimpses into what that struggle looks like on the ground. It is varied, often piecemeal, and never-ending. None of the stories that I told you actually has a conclusion, an end. But really, to what ends are these struggles engaged? There are local answers to that question, of course. Merchants and city officials in Berkeley want to reorder their streets such that the presence of street people is minimized, while activists seek to keep them open as a place where the destitute can hang out. Other activists grab hold of public spaces like Frank-Ogawa's Park to publicize, quite literally, a set of claims about the inequities and oppressions of the world that we live in, and in the process experiment with making new forms of life in public. The University of California has long wanted to either eliminate People's Park altogether or to remake it as a quite different kind of public space, one in which programming, especially for students, is paramount, while park defenders, as they always call themselves, and others have sought to retain it as a free space, a commons, that stands at least in partial opposition to the alienating landscapes of the contemporary capitalist city. But I think there's a more global, more abstract answer as well. I've been asserting that the end of public space, end in the sense of closing it down, controlling it, enrolling it in the process of capital accumulation, is always a tendency in capitalism. This tendency has another name. It is the tendency and necessity of capitalism to produce abstract space. So what's abstract space? Though it predates capitalism, capitalist abstract space is the spatial equivalent of Marx's abstract labor. Abstract labor is labor abstracted out of its specific, decidedly non-homogeneous forms and made commensurable, tradable, exchangeable. It is how we know that the labor embodied in the computer that I wrote these words on is equivalent to X units of the labor that went into the machines that churned out the strands of the linguine that I boiled that night for dinner, or the Y units of labor that went into the pasta itself. Or actually, it is not how we know this, but rather the concept as well as the material reality that lets us begin to see how, in practice, specific, qualitatively different kinds of labor are made equivalent to each other. Similarly, abstract space is a medium of exchange with the necessary implications of interchangeability tending to absorb use, which is to say, it is capitalist space and a capitalist commodity. The production of abstract space, or the constant attempt to produce abstract space, despite all the spatial practices that seek to produce it in other ways, is a capitalist necessity. This is to say that space in capitalism must be produced so as to be commensurable, so as to be abstractable, and therefore exchangeable. One must be absorbed into, use must be absorbed into exchange, with the latter, exchange, dominant. Only alternative spatial practice, practice that remakes space against, in spite of, or within capitalist abstract space, can create a different kind of space, and must do so if either life, or in fact if capitalism, is to survive. Right? Capitalism cannot survive on abstract space alone. In this sense, today more than ever, the class struggle is inscribed in space. Indeed, it is that struggle alone which prevents abstract space from taking over the whole planet and papering over all differences. Only the class struggle has the capacity to differentiate, to generate differences which are not intrinsic to economic growth qua strategy, logic, or system. That is to say, differences which are neither induced by nor acceptable to that growth. The forms of class struggle are now more varied than formerly. Naturally, they include the political action of minorities. This is Lefebvre writing in 1969, in fact. Frank Agawa was designed and developed as a part of a strategy to remake Oakland's floundering downtown. Actively disinvested beginning in the 1950s, Oakland was hit especially hard by white flight and largely bypassed by the Bay Area's Silicon Tech boom that began in the 1970s and with ups and downs continues to this day. Oakland redeveloped the City Hall area as an attempt to re-commoditize its landscape, to produce the city as an abstract space open for investment and accumulation. Frank Agawa Park was a particular place within this strategy, and Michael Piatak and his associates were most certainly constrained in their plans by that fact. Their decision to retain a space for the remaining single-room occupancy residents is all the more admirable, I think, for this reason. But then, during Occupy, Agawa Park was taken and made into something else. It became a space not only within which new publics could recognize and represent themselves, but from which a larger assault on the abstraction of space and the logics behind it, which are the logics of accumulation that largely benefit the 1%. It became a center from which differential space, as Lefebvre calls it, could be produced and the capitalist abstraction of spaces could be contested. The tendency towards the end of public space, the tendency towards the abstraction of space, was interrupted by putting a particular public space to a different end. Which is to say, while abstract space is a production, it is also something that has to be maintained and policed. If one tendency is towards the production of abstract space, which includes the end of public space, then another tendency is always towards space's use. Just as abstract labor has to be enforced, socially necessary labor time, which really is what abstract labor is, socially necessary labor time is not natural, but the result of work, the work of foremen, of managers, of engineers, of time and motion specialists, and all the rest. So too does abstract space, the end of public space, have to be enforced and managed, both of which require considerable work. Ballot initiatives have to be composed and signatures have to be gathered. Police forces have to be organized and plans to clear out and retake public space have to be made and put into action. Jails have to be readied. Public relations officers have to be briefed. Laws have to be written. At each of these moments, in each of these steps in making and reinforcing abstract space, opposition, or even just other ways of being in space can arise. If they are not accounted for, if they are not managed, then they might just change what public space is. New differential spaces might arise. This is what happened in Frankengawa Park, and to some degree accounts for the ferocity of the park's retaking when it occurred. That was a reassertion of public space as abstract space. What kind of space, what degree of exchangeability and commensurability the streets of Berkeley was at stake in Proposition S, just as much as was the question of who could be on the streets and what they could do there. The proposition was an attempt to manage all the contradictory forces that arise when the tendency towards abstract space advances in the capitalist city. And the plans of the university and MK Think to fill People's Park with programming, to subject it to formal design processes, was likewise an attempt to manage the abstraction of space, to help assure that the exchangeability of space absorbs use. Use of these spaces, turning Frankengawa's Park into the people's bedroom, as well as a protest site, street people hanging out and finding allies in many city voters, and activist residents and organizations like Food Not Bombs seeking to retain People's Park as a commons. All of these make such assurance only ever a tendency, never a complete actuality. Public space is struggle. In this struggle, public space comes to be in its material actuality, as a site and as a place. And in coming to be, it both sets the bounds for what public space can be and for how the tendency towards the abstraction of space, the tendency towards the end of public space might, or in fact might not, be advanced. So, thank you.
We typically take questions from students.
Students first, excellent. Complaints are welcome as well. Those are the complaints.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. I guess my question is a clarification.
Yeah.
You said that capitalism cannot survive with just abstract space. Could you kind of explain that idea and why this public space is necessary?
Yeah, I'll try anyway. Just like our labor has to always be differentiated, right? We have to have qualitatively different kinds of labor, right? Capitalism itself requires qualitatively different kinds of spaces, right? There's a tendency towards making all the space the same. That's why I like my picture of abstract space, all of this suburban houses, right? It's kind of like where I grew up. And we can't live in a world like that, right? But there's a tendency to constantly reproduce those worlds. That's much of what the housing bubble was about, to really simplify it, 2006, 2007. And so then the remaking, the reusing of space, right, is something that allows, in many ways, capitalism to reinvent itself. right? As it reabsorbs those kinds of uses, just as it finds ways to commodify our various kinds of labor that we do, right? Or otherwise bring it into its system.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Are you a student?
No.
Yeah, Brooke, it only has to be one student? Okay, go ahead.
I'm quite happy.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to ask her a follow-up question. I'm not quite sure exactly what capitalism has to do with it. That is, if you were to deal with another system, hypothetical, make
Sure.
up any one you want, you might still have the same tension, say, between the university and People's Park, or what some people have a vision of People's Park. So you keep using these terms,
Yeah.
and using these other terms that you're changing, and I don't know what you mean by that. Anyhow.
Sure, okay, so the second part first, in the brief passing reference to Keynesianism, many of our cities were constructed as public cities, as cities in which certain kinds of publics formed in the post-war period, right? So if we take the Keynesian era from sometime during the New Deal up until sometime in the 1970s with the oil shock, and that was when modes of governance radically transformed, when ideas of kind of social democratic endowment were undone and so forth. That was a moment from sometime in the 30s to sometime in the 70s of kind of massive city expansion and transformation, remaking of cities around a certain kind of political economy, one that was based much more in the US, mild social democratic, but nonetheless social democratic sorts of forms, public investment, all those sorts of things, which then was dismantled in many ways beginning in the 1970s and into the contemporary period. And one of the effects of that, I think, was precisely the crises of the cities of the 1970s and into the 1980s. Crises of safety, crises of political economy, crises of all kinds that occurred during that time, and then the remaking of the city, beginning in the 1980s, really, as a much more highly privatized form of urban development. And so I was just making a very, very quick reference to that kind of transformation, that moment of switching. You're absolutely right that in any kind of political, economic, social system that we would want to think about, imagine, fight for, contradictions and tensions like these will not disappear. Right? I think they take a particular form within capitalism, where the hegemonic form of space production is around exchange, around the private property and selling the space. That the dominant form, it takes particular, these struggles work themselves out in particular ways because of that relationship. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. If we were working in a more social democratic, less neoliberal capitalist world, we might see things slightly different. I can give you an example of that actually relates very quickly, that's very interesting. And that has to do with the relationship between domestic and public space in a social democratic setting. A scholar by the name of Katarina Torn, who's Swedish, from Gothenburg, has done a number of very, very interesting studies about the remaking of the Gothenburg landscape. And the major ideology behind that, right, are two. Major ideology two. One is preserving the social democratic endowment of the Swedish public and the Swedish state. The second one is that the city is an extension of the living room. Right? And people need to start treating the city in the same way they would treat their own living room, the public part of that house. And what Katarina has shown is how terribly, terribly problematic this is. In part because it presumes that all of those who aren't already citizens, and she develops this argument and uses a lot of evidence for it, who are not already citizens, so largely immigrants, largely now from Turkey and North Africa and increasingly Iraq and Iran, that they are always understood only ever to be guests within that city space. Right? Their labor is absolutely necessary to the city and all those kinds of things. They're only ever guests because it's a living room. Right? It is not something that belongs to the public ideologically in the way that it's being framed. And that gets worked out in a very, very specific way within that social democratic context that is Sweden, right? What's left of the social democratic context that is Sweden. And And the ideologies governing uses of public space and the struggles over public space, the place of homeless people in public space, sort of have any number of family resemblances with those here, but also have a number of very, very different, quite specific forms to them in Sweden, in Katarina's telling of this. And so she does I can't do justice to the richness of the arguments she makes, but she does a very, very good job of showing how that extension of the domestic into the public under a particular kind of social democratic political economy is an exclusionary act against largely immigrants, also the very, very poor, some very poor native Swedish people, particularly homeless drug addicts. And so, so she shows exactly that. And so that kind of specificity, I mean, I wasn't doing it here much, but that kind of specificity around the political economy and its modes of governance, I think, is crucial for thinking in all these. If we were to look at tensions in the former socialist world or in what's still officially communist in China, we would find that those tensions are still there to get worked out in different ways. And China's an interesting case because capital circulation is so central to its development right now. But they get worked out differently there, largely around questions of work permits and people who are internal migrants and so forth, who are then excluded from those spaces. Still looks skeptical.
No, I don't understand. Go ahead.
So in your conclusion about the end of the
Yeah.
public space, I was thinking if there's any new public spaces being formed, and specifically for political activism, I was wondering what you thought of social media and online forums of spaces.
Yeah, I mean, social media and online spaces are absolutely vital organizing tools, right? But the modes of visibility online are radically different than they are in public. I mean, this is one reason why occupations like Occupy, Wall Street Occupy, and all the rest of them, or the big fights in Istanbul last year, Taksim Square, or the student movement in Chile, and so forth, have always moved into public. So much organizing goes on in various social media, so forth, but it's the bodies in public that really make a difference in terms of sometimes transforming how things work. It certainly stopped the plans for the redevelopment of Gezi Park and Taksim Square, and it's actually led to some very, very interesting transformations of neighborhoods within Istanbul and Ankara and some of the other cities. And so what I see social media being particularly crucial for is that mode is for organizing, right? Less so for the political act of being visible, right, in public. Although it has aspects of that can be very, very important. The key question for visibility is when larger publics pick up on some movement, right? Other forms of media begin to transmit whatever is going on. Sometimes that happens, quite often sometimes it happens because our bodies are there in public space. Sometimes, and I think increasingly so, it happens because something going online has caught the attention of a couple of influential journalists, right? And that can function something like these kind of public. But I do think political public spaces are being created all the time, all kinds of different ways. They're sometimes temporary, right? As with Occupy, as with Gezi Park. But then they can have very, very long-lasting effects. And the place where I think that is, the place I really think it's worth watching at is in the student movement, particularly in Chile, where they've been very, very creative about the use and occupation of space, and also about strategic retreats, right? In the face of police violence, in the face of waning energy, and all kinds of other things. They're very, very good at mapping out the city and figuring out what are the crucial symbolic sites to occupy and to fight over, but where are the places where they can actually gain strength, right? And for the students, it was not necessarily tents in the parks, but it was taking over their high schools, right? And many of the high schools themselves being private, taking over their high schools and pushing out the administration, right? And then remaking the classes themselves sometimes. But then using that space as one from which they could then move into the city. And university students did the same, in part because in Chile, as in most parts of the world outside of the United States, universities are autonomous, and the police can only come onto university campuses if they're invited on by the administration, and most administrations will not do that. There are various historical reasons. And so new kinds of space, the Chilean student movement in 2011, 2012 is really, really remarkable. And it's remarkable in part because of the way that they occupied space and made it public in a new way in order to argue for what is really a publicization of the city, a creating of a public good within the city in a highly, highly neoliberal, privatized kind of economy. And of course, all the social media were something to that. So it's a good for Steve.
So I'm thinking about, I think this distinction of sort of this conflict between sort of this capitalistic interest of these small businesses versus sort of the individual rights of people is a little tricky for me to swallow, because I'm imagining Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley, where businesses who are trying to get by and competing against each other are competing to not have people in front of their businesses because it's clear that that prevents customers from walking in. But at the same time, the people that they're competing against on that street are competing with one another. So whether they're playing instruments and looking for compensation, whether they're simply asking for money, there is compensation. I mean, there's competition for real estate, and that's why everyone's competing for the same space. The thing I'm concerned about in sort of rejecting these public means of reconciling those differences and competitions is if you aren't doing it within institutions, you're creating black markets in which those are competing. So I'm thinking of, especially in New York in, say, the 70s, there were incidents of violence against homeless people who were seen as sort of getting in the way of businesses. So I guess my question is about the conflict resolution. How do you think, what's the mechanism by which you resolve this if it's not through governance?
No, it's absolutely through governance. And that's one reason why I talked about that case, right? Because here is an initiative that's sponsored by the Property Business Improvement District of Telegraph Avenue and the Shattuck Avenue one. They were the ones who were behind it. And they were pushing this law. They're very common laws, as pointing out. The city council wasn't going to vote for it. They're the ones who said it's got to go on the ballot, right? And so the signatures were gathered, off went to the ballot. And then the campaign started, and the arguments were worked out. And what became very, very interesting in all of this is that the coalitions for and against did not break down easily along class lines, along merchant lines, for example, right? There were plenty of merchants who were opposed to law, who did not see this as a good way to mediate exactly those kinds of disputes, or what some saw as a problem lying on the sidewalks, right? And yet other business associations and business people were very much in support of it, right? So it did not break down easily along those lines, which is one of the very, very interesting things about it. And that was a moment where there was a set of rules that were most of the voters decided in the end, if you read some of the postmortems of all of this, that the problem that was seen by some of the merchants was not a problem at all, right? There aren't very good studies that show people are deterred from going to the stores or bars or restaurants, for example, by a daytime street population in Berkeley. And so there's, it didn't really fly entirely on its merits. So I agree with you that thinking about these things through questions of governance is important for the ways that you're talking about. So then the question becomes, right, we all agree, and I do, that, that order is not a bad thing, that order on the streets is good, right, that policing is necessary, right? The question becomes then, right, policing in whose interests, right, and how those get worked out and fought over and struggled over, and policing controlled by whom? Right? And should it be controlled through the ambassadors, right? Who would really be the ones enforcing this, the private security guards in there? Or should it be through the public police, where there is presumably some sort, in Berkeley there actually is some kind of public accountability for the police there. And those are very, very important questions, just as you're pointing out, right? Very, very live questions. That's exactly what's being struggled over. My point, in part, in this is I don't think the answer to that struggle is passing laws that say that people who can't afford to buy a coffee, right, or a drink, or whatever else, right, can't stay in this location, right? People can stay on a permanent bench, which is where, in fact, that's part of the problem also, that no one was sure what this was addressing. Pictures that I had, there are occasionally people sitting on the sidewalk itself. Mostly they were sitting on street furniture that was there for the public. What usually happens at that point is the street furniture is lifted, right? That's what happened on Mill Avenue in Tempe, for example. Once the sit line law was put into place, all the street furniture was taken out. That did nothing to resolve the problem either. So you're right, it's got to be in governance, right? In these kinds of struggles. That's why that case is so interesting. But it didn't resolve. That's also why I said that this is not. There's no end to this, right? It is totally unresolved, and it's in part for some of the reasons you were saying. First hearing.
I was wondering about, it's sort of another angle of the public space, and that is that a lot of municipal governments are selling off public space, and that is sometimes popular. I don't like it, but a lot of taxpayers like it. That actually, in our community, we just voted to sell some public space to the cops, right? This is the taxes, whatever, because the argument made. But I mean, that's happened in a lot of places because municipal governments say, well, yeah, we could turn this area that was public into a mall. So what about that? I mean, if there's kind of, it can be popular.
Oh, absolutely, it can be popular.
Yeah, and they're also revenue, often they want revenue, or they want to decrease taxes.
Or if not absolutely selling it off, the creation of things like conservancies to govern and to maintain the space is immensely popular, right? It's immensely popular. And the Central Park Conservancy, to pick the most prominent one, or Bryant Park Conservancy in New York City, right, are incredibly popular. The difficulty with those, with the conservancy side of this, is that it creates an incredibly uneven landscape of investment in parks, right? Which basically tracks where the money in the city is. So there is a lot of money for Central Park, for Bryant Park in New York City, and there's very, very, very little money for some of the small neighborhood parks in the South Bronx, for example, right, or in North Harlem. Because as the city, as conservancies have become successful, cities have cut back in public parks funds, for example, right? So selling off land becomes a way of dealing with fiscal problems, and conservancies become ways of doing it. Both modes of privatizing space in certain ways. One of the places where these sorts of issues are very, very interesting to move out of the US, which I normally think about, is in Britain at the moment. And in Glasgow, there's a place called North Kelvin Meadow. North Kelvin Meadow is a bit of waste ground. It had been a small sports field for about 50 years in the early 20th century, from about 1910 to about 1960, maybe 1970. It was a sports field. A couple schools were built nearby. There were tenements around it. It's not far from the Botanical Gardens. There's a big open space there that if you're in the Botanical Gardens is fine. And it's a mostly working class neighborhood. And when the city stopped putting money into it, right, trees started growing up through the clay tennis courts. There's now quite a nice forest there. Trees have been growing for about 40 years now. And there is the open area. There had been a running track in the people who lived around it eventually seeded it, the grass seed, right, created a meadow. That's why it's now called the North Kelvin Meadows. And in 2007, the city decided it was going to sell that land to a developer. It needed the money. It was going to use some of the money to build new sports facilities in Mary Hill, which is right next door. And they were going to do a number of other things. They had all their arguments in place. The people who had built up the meadow as a commons pushed back and fought back. And have fought back in all kinds of ways. And have been struggling since then over to try and maintain control over that area. One of the things that they're considering, that they've decided not to do it so far, is to create a community land trust in order to basically get the leasehold, because it's the way property law works. So get the leasehold for the land, so nothing can be built there. And their argument, as part of, they're not sure they want it is because they already think they own it, because they're members of the public and they've built it and they've done all that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of use of front rights that they've been pushing, and on top of that, bats breed on it, and so there's various and orchids. And so there's a number of environmental things that they push. And they're really interested in this. They're trying to decide what to do with it. And their argument is a very interesting one. They say, look, yeah, we created this meadow here. We created a commons. Everyone comes out and we have big barbecues here. The people walk their dogs, kids play, and that's great. If new tenements are built here, new apartments are built here, even with some component of below market rate housing and so forth, which is desperately needed in Glasgow, that will be the last thing that ever happens to this space. Right? Once you've built on it, you can't do anything else with it. As an open space, right? We've got community gardens in here. I might get tired of community gardens and want to play football instead, right? And it can be reconverted back into a playing field very, very easily. And they make a very, very interesting and good argument about the nature of that space as an open space. And once it starts being an open space, it's built on. It's not just the privatization that matters, it's the building on it that begins to matter. Yes, it might bring some money into the coffers of the Glasgow City Council. It might provide some money for building a couple of playing fields 2 miles north. But it means that community asset of an open space will never be again, right? And they've been successful to this point. They've been fighting this since 2006, 2007, something like that. And it's a very, very interesting set of struggles around exactly these issues. It's about neighborhood control versus what the city wants. It's about the interests of a city that is facing fiscal difficulties. It's about the way that the property markets. So right next door is a huge redevelopment going on in the old BBC headquarters when they rebuilt along the river. So all of those kinds of things get wrapped up in this one place. And it's a fight precisely over selling the land, which is, for the folks in Mary Hill, is actually a pretty popular idea because they'll get the playing fields, right? And so these are exactly the struggles that I find so fascinating.
I'm wondering which comes first, whether it's the city governments, whether it's people who are gentrifying cities with economic elites pressuring city governments to make public spaces more suitable to their interests, or whether it's the city governments changing public spaces to be more suitable to the interests of private elites so that they can attract these private elites.
Yeah. All right, FDIC's fast.
Those are good questions.
They're really good questions. On the first one, I'm totally ambivalent about a lot of this, more so than I might sometimes come across, for some of the reasons that you named, right? And what we need to do, after this big first flush of kind of sponsoring of everything, right? We need to start thinking about keeping sponsoring in its place, right? Who's the majority partner here, right? Right? Is it the public and taxpayers and the city and all those kinds of things, or is it the corporation? And in many of these agreements, it's the corporation, right? Bryant Park is the kind of the poster child for exactly this argument, right? The big donors get to close it off whenever they want. And the same thing happened in Millennium Park in Chicago all the time. And they with their agreements, get certain rights to the space that I find deeply problematic. And I think in the specific example you give, if they're just selling hot chocolate and don't give out baby formula, it'd probably be okay. Right? I won't go on an evil corporation rant, but I could. Right?
That's why I think that's
it's an interesting question. Right when I finished my master's degree, which is at Penn State, right after I left there, they made a big agreement with Pepsi, right? And you couldn't have Coke on campus anymore. I'm sure they're playing Coked out kids, but you couldn't have Coke on campus. And so I just addressed like a red letter to my MA advisor, and I would always address it to Darrell Coldsworth at Pepsi State University. That's what it became in many ways. And And there's, it's a state university. Well, I mean, so little of its funding comes from it. But there's something very problematic when that happens, right? When kind of the common wealth, the common good, right, is reworked, so it becomes the corporate wealth, and the corporate good becomes dominant. And I think we need to think about that, right, collectively, and find ways to kind of reassert who the dominant partner in the public and private thing ought to be. Not sure how to do that, because that gets to your second point, or to your point, right? That's exactly what your question is about. To the degree that capital is footloose, right, which is not to a total degree, but it's to a pretty big degree, then there is very little difference between a place like Syracuse, where I live, right, and a place like Fresno, where I used to hang out quite a bit. One's a bit warmer at times, a little less snow, and that's about it. But they're each declined, depressed cities that are seeking to attract any kind of inward investment that they can get. And we'll often do all kinds of things to do that, right, to attract those. Or if we think of big successful cities, they do the same sort of stuff to try and get the elites to come there, right? There was a study done sometime in the 80s, it's an old one now, but I imagine it's finding still. Now, they found that the single most important determinant as to where a company's headquarters are was the whims of the CEO, right? The desire of the CEO. Where does the CEO want to live, right? That became the most important question. There are other things too, like how fast you get your capital in or out, or whatever else. Mobil for a long time had a big check distribution, back when there were paper check distribution places in a very small town in Georgia. In part, it took 2 days longer to get the mail in and out of there than it did when, like from New York City or something. So when they were mailing out royalty checks, they got to play the float for a couple of days longer on average, right? So those kind of decisions become important. But, right, cities find themselves in a bind for precisely these reasons. They've got to find streams of revenue, and they think that by providing inducements, right, nice amenities of all kinds, tax breaks, whatever else, they will attract those folks. So a lot of it is places are being remade, places, gentrification is being supported, right, if not actively directed by cities, precisely to bring in a certain kind of people they think will help the tax base and so forth. But the other side is important as well, right? The role of wealthy people, the elites, of those of us with a bit of money who can move, a bit of foot looseness, right? Demanding certain kinds of things. And I'm not sure which one at the moment is more dominant. I think part of what we have to do to answer questions like that is focus not only on the question of what city governments themselves are doing, although that's absolutely crucial, not only what particular people in particular class positions are doing, but also what the circuits of capital are like. Where are the places, the opportunities for capital, global circulation of capital investment is, because gentrification is at root a question of capital circulation, right? It's where investment goes, right, and builds up or disinvests places, and where it doesn't go. And there are a set of patterns to that. There are a set of determinants to that need to be understood. As ongoing processes of overaccumulation, overproduction are at work globally, capital needs outlets. Those outlets are often the built environment, right? The place where capital can be invested in a built environment is often places that have been run down and depressed, right? This is the basic theory of uneven development. And through that then, they're rebuilt, they're regentrified, right? So paying attention to how those processes work is going on becomes a crucial question, I think, which says that the answer to your question is both.
I think we should,
All right.
yeah, so
Thank you.